The last thing Ethan ever expected after 12 years of marriage was a goodbye note folded neatly beside his half-drunk morning coffee. The steam had long faded, leaving a ring of cold bitterness, both in the cup and in his chest. "I need something more. Don't wait up. Sophie." That was it. No explanation. No final fight. No tears. Just silence, and the sound of her car pulling away that morning, echoing in his head like a door slamming shut on an entire chapter of his life. At 43, Ethan thought he had reached a kind of quiet stability. The bills were paid, the house modest but comfortable, and he had a steady job at the architecture firm he'd spent nearly 2 decades with. He wasn't flashy, but he was solid. Reliable. Predictable. Apparently too predictable for Sophie. He sat for hours that day at the kitchen table, staring at the note. His phone buzzed once, his sister asking if he was still on for dinner, and then nothing. Sophie was gone. And he knew deep down, even before the rumors, even before the Facebook photos and whispered confirmations from mutual friends, that she had left for someone else. She hadn't left to find herself. She'd already found someone. The cruelest part. She thought he'd fall apart. Maybe she wanted him to. Sophie had always been the louder one, the social one, the one who glided into rooms and took up space. Ethan had simply held the camera, fetched the coat, stayed in the shadows. In the days that followed, he collapsed into himself. Meals forgotten. Showers skipped. Work done mechanically, like muscle memory. At night, the bed was a hollow battlefield of memories, her side untouched, as if she might return. But she wouldn't. And every friend who called with sympathetic voices only made it worse, like he was some charity case. Poor Ethan, so quiet, so blindsided. But what nobody saw was what was happening inside him. The silence wasn't weakness. It was recalibration. Pain had a way of clarifying things. In his grief, he began to notice the decay that had seeped into their marriage long before Sophie left. The way her praise had become rare. The way she'd smile wider for strangers than she ever did for him. The way he'd been shrinking to fit the shape of her expectations. And slowly, one truth settled deep into his bones: her leaving was a betrayal, but it was also a release. He didn't know it yet, but this was his bottom. The ash-covered floor of his old life. And what Sophie didn't realize as she watched from afar, assuming he'd beg, spiral, collapse, was that ashes are not just remnants. They are also the soil where something new begins. And Ethan, broken but breathing, had just taken his first step towards something Sophie would never be part of again. The hardest part wasn't being left, it was figuring out who he was without her. In the first month after Sophie vanished from his life, Ethan wandered through the wreckage of his routines like a man lost in a familiar city that no longer felt like home. Every room carried the echo of her presence. The closet still held her scent, the bookshelf her taste in novels, and the music playlists always circled back to songs she loved. But then, something shifted. It happened quietly, without drama or realization, like dawn bleeding into night. Ethan was standing in the bathroom, toothbrush in hand, when he noticed it, the framed photo of their honeymoon in Santorini. It had been crooked for weeks. He reached out, straightened it, then paused, and took it off the wall. Just like that. One movement. No ceremony. The next day, more things followed: her robes, her favorite mug, the stack of unread travel magazines she used to leave around as a passive-aggressive reminder of the life she wished she had. There was no rage in it. No burning clothes or dramatic deletions. Just a quiet, deliberate removal of what no longer belonged in his world. Ethan started showing up to work earlier. Not because he had to, but because it helped. The stillness of the office before the day began offered clarity. His designs became sharper, more daring. He started sketching again, something he hadn't done for years, rediscovering the tactile joy of pen on paper. His co-workers noticed, not the pain he carried, but the fire quietly returning to his eyes. He didn't tell anyone about the therapy sessions. Once a week, he sat across from a woman with kind eyes and a sharper tongue, someone who challenged his patterns and made him confront things he'd buried. Not just the loss, but the parts of himself he'd given up to make Sophie comfortable. "You didn't crumble," she said one afternoon, leaning back in her chair. "You were never broken. You were buried. And now you're digging your way out." He joined a gym, not out of revenge or vanity, but because he missed the feeling of control over his own body. The physical pain of lifting weights mirrored the emotional weight he was learning to carry. And over time, his body responded. His posture improved, his energy returned, and he caught himself one morning in the mirror, blinking at the man looking back. He looked tired, yes, but also stronger. Cleaner. Like someone who had been through something and survived. Sundays became sacred. He turned them into slow rituals, morning runs through the park, coffee from the quiet shop on 9th where no one knew his name, and hours at the local library, poring over books he'd never had time to read. He wasn't chasing distractions anymore, he was rediscovering desire. Real, rooted desire. Not the desire to impress, or perform, or win someone back, but the desire to live fully, even if quietly. Friends noticed, even if he said little. His sister, Maya, commented during a family dinner, "You seem different. Grounded. Like, you're back in your skin again." He smiled softly at that, not needing to explain. Because yes, he was. For the first time in years, he was learning to breathe without waiting for someone else to tell him when it was safe to exhale. He didn't check Sophie's social media. Not once. He didn't block her either, he simply removed her from his line of sight. She no longer occupied the front row of his life. Let her believe he was nursing wounds in silence. Let her imagine he sat by the window waiting. The truth was far less poetic, and far more powerful. Sophie had mistaken his silence for collapse. What she failed to understand was that some men do not explode, they rebuild. Quietly. Steadily. Brick by brick. Ethan didn't talk about the pain. He didn't update his friends on his healing or post vague quotes about betrayal. He let his actions speak. He let the peace in his home, the definition in his jawline, the calm in his tone, all speak volumes. By the end of that second month, Ethan stood in a space that felt entirely his own. Not just physically, but emotionally. He hadn't moved houses, but it felt like a new home. The air had changed. It was no longer shared, negotiated, or filtered. It was his. The silence had not broken him. It had built him. By the time spring melted into summer, Ethan had become almost unrecognizable, even to himself. Not in the way grief makes you hollow or unkempt, but in how growth makes you sharper, lighter, and more certain of your direction. His edges were cleaner now, his thoughts more precise. His routines, once heavy with sadness, had transformed into rituals of intention. One morning, standing in front of his closet, he noticed how his wardrobe had quietly evolved. Gone were the outdated cardigans Sophie used to buy him. Instead, his clothes now reflected who he was becoming, crisp shirts in colors he never dared to wear before, tailored jackets that gave him a quiet, effortless confidence. There was no audience he was dressing for. It was for him. A mirror, not a stage. At work, things shifted quickly. A senior architect had left the firm unexpectedly, and Ethan, once content to remain in the background, stepped into the void without hesitation. His proposal for an eco-housing initiative stunned the board with its precision and innovation. When the firm's director asked if he'd be willing to lead the project and head the new division, Ethan didn't flinch. He said yes, calmly, as if he'd known all along that this moment would find him. The promotion came with a corner office, a substantial salary bump, and something even more valuable, autonomy. He wasn't just executing other people's visions anymore. He was setting the tone. The irony wasn't lost on him, he'd spent years designing homes while feeling lost in his own. Now, he was building foundations not just for others, but for himself. Ethan didn't rush into new romance. He didn't swipe through dating apps or attend singles events like some post-divorce cliché. But he wasn't closed either. He allowed life to bring him connections naturally. One of those connections came in the form of Claire, a woman he met at a photography exhibit he almost didn't attend. She was a curator, funny and observant, with a way of noticing the details others overlooked. They didn't fall into each other. They circled slowly, like two people who'd learned not to mistake excitement for compatibility. They met for coffee, then long walks, then dinners where time slipped away unnoticed. Ethan didn't tell Claire about Sophie right away, and she didn't pry. He appreciated that. With Claire, he felt no pressure to prove anything. He could just exist. And she seemed to like the version of him that simply showed up as he was. Meanwhile, Sophie remained a ghost in his world, until one afternoon when her presence returned with a ping. A mutual friend tagged him in a photo from an industry event, and a few minutes later, she watched it. Then she watched another post. Then another. Ethan noticed, but he didn't react. There was no need. The algorithms were doing their work, showing her what she had walked away from. In the photo, Ethan was giving a talk about sustainable design. The caption read, "Powerful ideas from one of the sharpest minds in the business. Proud to call this man our new lead architect." The image captured him mid-sentence, sleeves rolled, eyes lit with conviction. It wasn't posed. It wasn't performative. It was simply Ethan. Later that evening, she messaged him. A single line, "You look really good. I'm happy for you." He stared at it for a while before closing the app without responding. Because Ethan didn't rise to get even. He didn't evolve to impress. And he certainly wasn't climbing out of the ashes just so the person who scattered them could witness his glow. His rise had nothing to do with Sophie anymore. In fact, it never really did. She was simply the spark that lit a fire that had long been smoldering under the surface. Now, when Ethan walked into a room, people turned. Not because of the suit he wore or the job title he carried, but because of the presence he brought with him. Grounded. Certain. Untouchable in the best way, not guarded, but self-contained. He reconnected with his old friends. Started mentoring junior architects. Volunteered his weekends to teach design classes at the community center. He found joy in contributing, not for applause but for purpose. Each of these small actions, stitched together, became the fabric of a new life, one he had shaped with his own hands. One evening, Claire looked at him across the table, the candlelight flickering between them. "You seem like a man who finally knows what he wants," she said softly. Ethan smiled. "Not everything. But I do know what I don't need anymore." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. That was enough. Ethan had rebuilt not just a life, but a sense of self so strong that it no longer needed validation. Sophie's absence wasn't a wound anymore, it was simply a fact. One he had accepted. One he had transcended. He wasn't waiting to be acknowledged. He had already arrived. It was supposed to be temporary, this space she claimed after leaving Ethan. A modern apartment with tall windows and expensive furnishings she thought would reflect her independence. At first, it felt liberating. Every untouched surface, every night alone in a queen-sized bed, gave her the illusion of starting over. She told herself she had outgrown their life together, convinced that Ethan's steady, unshakable nature had become a burden rather than a blessing. She thought he would collapse. She imagined him spiraling into himself, buried in whiskey and old wedding photos, maybe calling late at night, desperate for closure or second chances. That's how these things usually went. She'd seen it before, men unraveling, lost in the void left behind. But Ethan hadn't called. Not once. No texts. No long, aching emails. Not even a reaction to her passive posts about starting over or reclaiming joy. At first, she chalked it up to pride. Then stubbornness. Then denial. But weeks turned into months, and all she heard was silence. That silence slowly transformed into something else, curiosity. She began asking around subtly, masked as casual conversation. A coworker mentioned seeing Ethan at a charity fundraiser, speaking on a panel about urban development. He looked great, they said offhandedly. Sharp. Confident. Different. That word stuck with her, different. Later that week, she gave in and checked his profile, something she had sworn she wouldn't do. The first image was of him at a conference, shaking hands with a city official. Another had him surrounded by young architects, clearly teaching, clearly leading. He looked healthier than he had in years. Broad-shouldered. Calm. Eyes clearer than she remembered. And when she scrolled further, she found a short video of him laughing in a group, relaxed in a way that didn't feel forced. There was no sadness in those images. No trace of a man who missed her. Just someone who had stepped fully into his own life. She clicked through the photos faster now, looking for something, anything, that hinted he still carried her memory. A vague caption, an old photo, a friend's comment. But there was nothing. Just a man who had reclaimed space she once occupied. Not angrily. Not bitterly. Just, completely. That night, for the first time since she left, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed replaying conversations she once dismissed. The times Ethan had tried to connect, when he offered to go on weekend trips she turned down, or the way he listened patiently during her career rants, even when she never asked about his own work. She remembered his quiet gestures, the coffee ready each morning, the way he used to warm her car in the winter, how he always made sure to leave a light on if she came home late. Back then, it had all felt ordinary. Now, those ordinary things felt like riches she had tossed aside in search of a mirage. The next morning, as she scrolled again through his profile, she noticed a photo she hadn't seen before. Ethan and a woman, light brown hair, soft smile, standing close but not clingy. They weren't flaunting anything. They didn't have to. The comfort in their body language said enough. Sophie stared at the image longer than she should have, heart tapping against her ribs like a warning bell. There it was, the reality she'd been avoiding. He had moved on. She clicked the woman's tag and landed on a page full of subtle elegance. No oversharing. No drama. Just art, architecture, and glimpses into a quiet life. A different life. A better fit for the man Ethan had become. Sophie felt her stomach turn, not out of jealousy, but because she finally understood the full picture. She hadn't just left Ethan. She had removed herself from the very story she assumed would always include her. She remembered something he once said during an argument, not shouted, just calmly delivered, "You always expect me to stay in the same place while you go looking for more. One day, I won't be where you left me." At the time, she had rolled her eyes. She thought he was bluffing. But now, staring at the screen, she realized he had been telling her exactly what would happen. She just hadn't believed him capable of that kind of departure. The ache wasn't rage or regret. It was grief, for the version of herself who hadn't seen the man she had. For the life she could have grown into if she hadn't been so fixated on escaping. She imagined what it must feel like now, to walk beside Ethan, not the man she left, but the one who had risen without her. And then the final weight dropped. She would never know that version of him. He wasn't hers to rediscover. She tapped out a message, just one line, "You look really good. I'm happy for you." It sat on read, unanswered. And in that single, lingering moment of silence, Sophie understood something irreversible. She had left thinking he would crumble. Instead, she watched him rise, and she wasn't invited. The message sat in his inbox for 2 days before Ethan acknowledged it. Not because he was unsure how to respond, but because it simply wasn't a priority. By now, Sophie's words, "You look really good. I'm happy for you. Felt more like a nod from a stranger than a tether to a shared past. He didn't reply. And he didn't feel guilty about it. Instead, he kept living the life he had carefully, deliberately built. The promotion had turned into a leadership position that allowed him to handpick his own team. Claire and he had just returned from a weekend trip to Vermont, no grand declarations, just snow-covered cabins, hot cider, and quiet, content mornings beside someone who made space for his silence instead of filling it with questions. But Sophie wasn't done. A week after her message went unanswered, she emailed him, longer this time. She apologized. Not just for leaving, but for how she left. She said she now saw the value of everything she'd once taken for granted. She said she missed the way he made her feel safe. The way he always listened. The way he never made her feel small, even when she didn't deserve that kindness. She wrote, "I made a mistake. I see that now. And I'd like to talk. Even if it's just once." Ethan read the email in the late afternoon, sunlight spilling across his desk, warming the oak. He sat back in his chair, eyes lingering on the words, not with anger, not even sorrow, but a kind of detached clarity that only time and true healing could deliver. There had been a time when this message would have broken him. A time when he would have read it hoping for a second chance, imagining closure in the form of reconnection. But not now. Closure wasn't a conversation. It was peace. And Ethan had already found his. Still, he believed in kindness, so he responded, short and respectful. "Sophie, I appreciate your words and I genuinely hope you find what you're looking for. I've moved on, and I'm in a good place now. I wish you the same. No bitterness. No resentment. Just the truth." She didn't reply. But he knew she read it. And in some way, Ethan imagined that hurt her more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. He hadn't slammed a door in her face, he had simply walked through it a long time ago, never looking back. The weight of that quiet finality said everything. Months passed. Sophie faded back into the blur of his past. Not as a villain, not even as a tragic memory, but as something once familiar and now irrelevant. She had been part of his story, but not the ending. Claire noticed something different in him too. A lightness. Not the forced kind that masks pain, but the genuine ease of a man who no longer carried ghosts on his shoulders. One night, while walking hand in hand under a canopy of city lights, Claire leaned in and whispered, "You know, I've never met someone so at peace with their past." Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "That's because it no longer owns me." And that was the truth of it. Sophie had thought he would crumble. Instead, she was left standing outside the fire she had sparked, watching it burn into something beautiful, without her. No invitation extended. No seat saved. Just Ethan, reborn. Whole. Unshaken. Free.